it will be interesting to see who regulates what and how that is managed going forward. And I think, in fact, this is a topic that's now becoming more and more pressing. It's becoming evident, partly internally to the organization, that all these technologies are kind of nudging us towards changing, and actually more than nudging, and for the whole sector.
Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where I meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Hello, Shipping Podcast listeners. Welcome to the 124th episode of the Shipping Podcast. As I have shared with you before, I had the pleasure of visiting the International Maritime Organization, IMO, in London in June this year. And I seized the opportunity to do some interviews with people who works there. This is the fourth and the last interview I did at that time. And I'm so happy to introduce to you the project manager for the functional review at the International Maritime Organization, Madss Svendsen. If you don't know what the functional review is, don't worry. You can either go back to episode 121 with Linda Ryan, or just think that Madss is working with changing the IMO from the inside. I will not keep you any longer. This is Madss Svendsen for you. Welcome to the Shipping Podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Madss Svendsen. I'm the project manager of the functional review at the International Maritime Organization.
And what is your background?
So I'm an economist by training, partly from Copenhagen, but also here from London School of Economics. And after I finished my studies, I went to Hong Kong and ended up in finance, doing project finance. We did quite a bit of finance for Ericsson early on in China as they were expanding into the mobile market in China. This is the mid-90s. And then I went from there to Vietnam, where I worked first for the United Nations and ended up sitting in the Ministry of Fisheries, restructuring seafood companies. The Ministry of Fisheries in Vietnam controls 50 companies, and they became the second largest exporter of seafood, Vietnam, in the world, so it was quite an interesting sector to be in. After that, I went to New York, ended up setting up and running a team inside the UN that works on organizational change. Did that for 16 years, and also as part of that, set up a platform across the UN to help UN organizations across the globe reorganize and renew and improve. And just recently, I've joined IMO to help them with their functional review.
So you haven't got the bug yet, the maritime bug. You're not bitten and smitten.
No, I always liked ships. I've been sort of on a couple of tall ships for a few weeks off the coast of Venezuela, the ABC Islands, and down the coast of France. Did grow up with some sailing in my youth. I'm Danish. Yeah, but the maritime sector is new to me, and I find it fascinating. As I said, I worked in the seafood industry before. It's always interesting to dive into a new industry and figure out what's what and who's who. And the maritime sector is full of stories and legends, so it's definitely a great opportunity.
So how are you going to change IMO from the inside then?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. Usually when I work with an organization, you kind of want to understand the culture first. So you take a little bit of time to get to know who are the influences and where does the organization want to go. Does it know where it wants to go? Has it been talking about different options for a long time, but hasn't quite moved on it? So issues like that. So you kind of do a bit of a reconnaissance of the current situation. And I've sort of done that now 6 months in. So it's an interesting time where we're going to move and start looking at, okay, so what are some of the opportunities to improve? The way we have scoped out the project in this first phase is that we partly have a section that works on strategy issues, so the what and why. A section that works on the processes and systems, more the how do we get better at some of these processes. We prioritized 7 groups of processes, and when I say processes, we mean things like recruitment or managing these meetings. You may know that IMO hosts 23 big meetings every year. Many of the meetings have 1,000 delegates. We have member states from 174 countries, so it's a very big production. Actually, right now we have the Technical Cooperation Committee meeting, and there are a lot of people in the house. Right now we have very good facilities here in London. So processes like that require a review now and then. The world moves on. There's a lot of new technologies that make different ways of working possible. So we're building that into the functional review project. In fact, this last 2 days, I've been talking to external consulting companies to come in to help us with the digital part of the review. So we're looking for opportunities, whether it's the experience of the member states when they come into the meetings, their ability to call in from outside if they're sitting around the world and they do not want to fly to London, cannot fly to London. We have a number of publications. Obviously, the world is moving electronic there as well. So instead of printing, can we sell them electronically? So that's another area we're looking at. And then there are just practical things about buying things, hiring people, and that all sits on systems that also need to be upgraded. So that's a big part of the work. And then, of course, there's the people and culture part, where we are working on learning not just training courses, but learning in every way that people learn these days, whether it's online, whether it's site visits. A few weeks ago, I went to see a cruise ship down in Southampton, together with some member state representatives, but also some colleagues. So these are all learning opportunities. So we're trying to build that in and then, involve everybody. It's very much a bottom-up as well as top-down process. So we've had a lot of sessions. I think we had since September, we just took stock, about 40 sessions with an average of 8 people in each session. So it's been very inclusive just inside IMO. And IMO is a relatively small organization. We're only 300 plus staff here in London.
That is so interesting. I think for people outside who doesn't know, I'm just starting to understand IMO from the inside. I didn't know. But usually it's more like a grey building in London.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, no, and it is interesting. I think that's one thing that's been very clear as we've been taking stock of the situation, is that the visibility of IMO is not what it could be. And particularly when you think about it for a moment, that 90% of world trade happens on the oceans. So obviously it's a very important issue, and to be the regulator on the safety and security and environmental issues related to that is a big deal. So one of the conversations that's there is, okay, so I think we're doing well in terms of managing and hosting these meetings where the discussion is on the regulations, but there's also an implementation part. And certainly from my experience working across the UN, there's a lot of opportunity for us to do more and perhaps also be more visible by supporting member states that need support or would want support in some of the implementation and enforcement of the regulations. So I think that is a possible next frontier. It's already happening. Obviously, the technical cooperation work is about that. There's 3,000 plus people trained every year through IMO's technical cooperation program. But there could be a lot more in terms of institutional capacity building and also follow through and working with, perhaps particularly with certain member states like the less developed countries or the so-called SITs, so the island states, that may not have the same resources as other states to implement. And I think that's one of the things we're looking at in the strategy component of this functional review.
So you've been here for 6 months. So what are the biggest... Are there any similarities with other UN bodies, or what are the biggest differences?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, because I've worked, I think maybe uniquely, I've worked with, I don't know, maybe 20 different organizations in the UN. I've actually been sitting in one of them mainly, But I was lucky enough to be able to take clients from across the UN. So we did it on a cost recovery basis. We basically internal advisors on change. So I have a bit of a sense of quite a few different organizations. I helped the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights with their reorganization. Last year, I worked with IFAD, which is an international financial institution that focuses on agricultural development. They're in Rome, so I worked with them. So I have a little bit of a flavor of the similarities and differences. And clearly, coming in from sitting with the UN Development Program, which has 17,000 people sitting across 170 countries and country offices in 135 countries, to IMO that has 320 staff, mainly in London. I think there's maybe 20 that sit outside London. And there's obviously we have training institutions as well in Malmö and Malta, which are important. That's a big change. I mean, so both in terms of size and focus, this is a regulatory body. The UN Development Program is very much implementation support, capacity building. So, but there are some other organizations that are specialized and have some similarities. And when we're doing this review, we're of course looking partly to those that are similar, but we're also being very mindful that we have to be careful because we may actually not learn the right lessons from each other. Yeah, because just because they're similar doesn't mean that they're doing things better than we are, that they're doing things in the best way. So we have to look also at organizations that are trying to do similar things and are succeeding. And that could be outside the UN as well. You know, regulatory bodies that also support implementation. How do you do that? How do you advocate for implementation? How do you oversee implementation or support implementation? But inside the UN, just to answer your question, the ones that are usually referred to here is ICAO, so the International Civil Aviation Organization. That's in Montreal. And they have a similar role for the whole airline industry. So again, the airline industry comes together. This is set the regulations for the planes. There are auditors going in to audit the airports on a 3-year cycle in ICAO, so they have some similarities. We have started an audit program also here in IMO a few years back that does some of that, maybe not with the same scope and rigor that the ICAO does it yet, but so that's one reference point. The other one is WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Right Organization in Geneva, and they also have a lot of industry input into their conversations about how do you manage patents. So those are two reference points. Sometimes IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, is referred to. So in talking to them about, and when we look at how we manage the planning process, we've talked to all of these and say, okay, how do you do that? How have you defined your results? How you defined your resources? How have you mobilized resources for your results? So on. So yes, there are some that are similar, and there are some that are very different, because the UN is a little bit, the best way to think about the UN is like a plethora of ministries in your home country. So you have the Ministry of Agriculture, you know, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Planning, and so on and so forth. So the UN is in a similar way kind of stretched out, and there's not one UN, there's many parts to the UN.
The reason also for me asking is that, I mean, the mariners or the maritime industry always refers to ourselves as being very special.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think it's time to move away from that.
Yeah, I mean, actually working on change as I do and I have been, you'd be surprised. Everybody always says that when, you know, if I go and work with a country office in India, they will say we're very unique. If I go to the country office in Laos, they will say they're unique, and they are unique. There is a uniqueness to every organization. There's also a lot of similarity, you know. So you can look for what's different, and you can look for what's the same, and mostly, I would say things are the same, but it's fascinating because it speaks to the picture, the question of culture in general, and culture is is organizational culture, which is partly a picture of where the staff come from, but it's also a picture of where the organization is headquartered, which I found quite interestingly in moving from a New York headquarter organization to a London-based headquarter organization here. So you see certain elements of the English culture seeping into how things are done here versus, the New York and the American culture. But yes, I mean, the maritime sector is unique, no doubt. I think it's a fascinating area, but there's more and more blending of all these sectors, and you see it more than anywhere in the digital space. Yeah? Whereas, and we were talking about regulations, a lot of things that in the future will be regulated in and around ships will relate to technologies that are not unique to ships, whether they're, 5G, sensors, drones, like remote navigation systems, unmanned ships or vehicles. It's sort of the same topic, and actually the knowledge that you bring in a conversation like this is probably more about technology than about the sea and the maritime sector. So it will be interesting to see who regulates what and how that is managed going forward. And I think, in fact, this is a topic that's now becoming more and more pressing. It's becoming evident partly internally to the organization that all these technologies are kind of nudging us towards changing, and actually more than nudging, and for the whole sector.
Yeah, I live in Gothenburg, so I hear a lot about autonomous cars and all of that. So we've got a lot of experts in my neighborhood, more to say. And then I think, why don't we take advantage of that in the maritime industry? But that's another silo.
Yeah, and that's kind of the same point.
Yeah.
I think there's it's an obvious idea, and I think it's a matter of there's always some inertia in terms of moving into, talking to new groups of stakeholders. There's a comfort talking to your own kind. Yeah. And that's one thing I observed here, is that there is a tendency to become a little insular, in the sense that, so you have maritime authorities coming to these meetings, whereas, in some ways, when you're talking about the environmental footprint of shipping, you do see it in the big meetings. There's a big meeting called the MEPC, where increasingly we see the ministries of environment and state departments showing up, and others, because the interest is broader than the maritime sector per se. And in the technology space, you will see similar things. Now, technology is a little bit more difficult to put your arms around. Who owns technology in this? Which ministry are you dealing with? Which department are you dealing with? If you wanted a representative from Indonesia to come to a meeting, I mean, you can get somebody from the maritime sector, and there may be somebody who has something to say about unmanned ships, but that person may have been working the last 40 years in a port, and may not, may bring something for sure, but not the cutting edge. So it's an interesting challenge. Yeah.
I agree. And I'm so happy to be around at this time when everything is changing. We are going through changes in our industry, and as you are talking about, I'm always going through changes as well, and it is exciting. And the fourth industrial revolution is somewhere around us all as well, and we need to adapt.
Absolutely. No, I think it's very exciting. I think it's this type of changes and this type of driver of change, because the typical drivers of change is, the world has moved on, and or the budget is either bigger or smaller, or we actually have changed our strategy and we want to focus on B instead of A. But the technology factor has always been there to some degree. Obviously, it's not like it's in front of us. It's also behind us. The last 30 years, what's happened with computers and working on laptops, working from everywhere remotely.
Smartphones,
So we I guess in a way we always forget. It's almost as if the change is always ahead of us rather than we're in the middle of it, because this kind of conversation we're having now with 2 mics and a few little gizmos on the table, it would have been a different production just 20 years ago.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's exciting, isn't it?
It definitely is, yeah.
So how do you see the future for the shipping industry going forward?
Okay, I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that question. I know that I'm not. It's interesting. I'm been learning over the last 6 months about the consolidation that's happening, whether it's with regards to the flag states, or whether it's regard to the building of ships, or whether it's regards to the recycling of ships. And yes, there's definitely a trend towards things moving towards Asia. I mean, China and Korea. China in particular is becoming a very big player in all of these 3 areas that I just mentioned. The other big trends, whether it's technology, which I think will drive a lot of the change, is asymmetric in the sense that when we look across the merchant ship fleet, the average age is 20 years plus. And that means that a lot of ships will not have this kind of technology. And a lot of ports don't deal with, the sensors, the drones, So we also, there's a bias, the Google bias, you put something in, you're searching for, technology, and then you get like lots of things about unmanned ships, and you think every ship is soon going to be unmanned. But I think, as far as I understand, there's most likely there will be less people on the ships. There will be some unmanned ones that are almost like kind of showcases, and I think there are already some up in the Norwegian fjords and so on that they're testing. But most of the fleet will not be like that, and most of the realities will still be very different. So we have to kind of learn to differentiate our view of the sector in both how we regulate, and this is, I think, you may have also follow that, the whole conversation about goal-based regulations as opposed to thou must do such and such very technical decrees on how things should happen. It will be there because of this differentiation in terms of the fleet. There will be a need to be very mindful of that and how things are regulated. And then the other big trends, obviously trade drives a lot of it. There are trade wars going on. Nobody can predict fully where that will take us. But there is increased intra-regional trade. Again, the statistic that comes to mind is that I think about 40% of world trade by 2030 will be in the Asia region. So there will be a lot of intra-regional trade in Asia. So all these things shift things in different ways. I mean, one issue that I haven't fully put my head around is the whole issue of flag versus port versus coastal states and what that means in terms of regulations and incentives in the sector. But I'm looking at that, and I'm hoping I'll understand it at some point.
But also another layer that I find interesting is that the average ship owner owns 10 ships. So that is like family-owned ships. Yeah. And they live out of that. And how can we expect them to adapt all the new stuff that we are talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just having lunch where the delegate from Greece, the permanent representative to Greece, he's just about to go back to Greece after 3 years here. He was there, and we were talking about the Greek ship owners, because they obviously, I think they own about 20% of the ships, although increasingly many of them are under different flags, and how many of them is a family business, and it's generational, and they weathered the storm, pardon the pun, by not having the pressures of commercially listed companies on them, and they've been able to divest and expand with the changing tides. So yes, it's a good question when something like the sulfur cap comes in the 2020, and the cost of whether it's the scrubbers or the different fuels come in. Yeah, what's the impact on relatively smaller players? And I think that's
autonomous ships. I mean, how can they? I mean, they will not be the first ones.
No, they will definitely not. But then I think, again, back to the differentiation and the asymmetry. I mean, I think they also been used to adapting. I mean, we were talking over lunch about the history of the Greek fleet, partly being on the back of some ships that the Americans, I think they were passing on to them after the Second World War, that were supposedly built to just last for one trip. But they ended up lasting for decades, and they made a lot of good use of those. So I think it's a very agile, adaptive, resilient breed, those ship owners.
Yeah, and they are innovative in every sense there is, and they love their ships, and they are cutting edge, sort of thinking about technique and so on. I think so. I will be the first one to give them cred, but sometimes, regulations are more done maybe for the big ones because it's easier to see them and
no, it's a very fair point. And you do see these things discussed, the impact of some of these things, and I think that's one of the difficulties with, I think, particularly the environmental agenda and the urgency around it, is that you would like to go slower and so that it could be a more gentle adaptation. At the same time, the environment needs, there's a need for things to happen. I think we're up against the clock on some of these things, and we're also sitting under a much bigger agenda of trying to actually deal with the climate change issues.
Did you ever have a role model growing up?
No, not other than the usual ones. So you're like kind of your parents and your grandparents, and no, I don't think I had any icons. I can't say I did.
Do you think it's important to have that in our industry? Role models?
In the maritime industry in particular?
Yeah, in every, but I'm talking about maritime now. So.
Well, I think it's always great and very helpful to have moral leadership, in particular, whether it's the Dag Hammarskjölds of this world or whether it's Mandela or, I think that era of sort of icons and leadership, it has done a lot for the world. So I think it's good. I think it's increasingly more difficult to be one of those. I mean, I think also with the media being what it is and finding, sort of faults in everyone and publishing it within minutes, to create that aura is very difficult. But yes, I think the world needs leadership.
I totally agree. So who do you think I should interview the next? Who would you be interested in listening to in a podcast like this?
I'm curious, but this is also because I'm new, like Peter Thomsen, who is involved in the UN ocean work.
I have met him. You can listen to him in my podcast.
Okay, you already talked to him. I don't know him, but I think it's interesting to look at the ocean governance issues more broadly. It's a very interesting space. Technology, I mean, any of the big ones, the musts of this world, and I mean any of those who can talk about what they see the future looking like in terms of autonomous. I was in Amsterdam a few weeks ago, and I was in the airport. They have Tesla taxis now, and you step into these. This is like being in a spacecraft, with the doors opening and closing by themselves and coming out like wings. And like this massive computer screen in front of you. So these things are already happening, but I wonder what some of the visionaries in the tech industry see, and I'd be very curious to hear what they had to say.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me.
Not at all. My pleasure.
It was very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Madss. I cannot wait to see what your job leads to. As we agreed in the interview, it's exciting times that we live in right now. I will put a link in the show notes to episode 98 with Peter Thomsen if you would like to listen to the United Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean that Madss was referring to when I asked him who he would be interested in listening to in the shipping podcast. I have just come back from the Vista International AGM and Conference 2019, hosted by Vista Cayman Islands. So I am filled with sunshine, new energy, joy, and I have made a lot of new friends again. This was my 15th Vista International AGM, so you understand that I have been around for a while. Every time I visit these events, I feel blessed that I know so many strong, competent women who are eager to share their knowledge and their wisdom with me. They are my support system, and they are my sounding board when it comes to a lot of different things. And this year, I had the pleasure of being invited on a panel to speak about diversity and gender bias, together with some distinguished women from around the world. By the time I had the microphone, I couldn't help but spilling the beans, because I'm so fed up being on panels consisting of women only, speaking about diversity in front of a room filled with women. That doesn't do anything for diversity. Diversity and inclusion is not the responsibility for women. It's something we need to do together, all of us. We need to be the change that we so much want. It starts with us. We cannot repeat the mistakes that is so obvious to us. We need to do things in a different way. So, instead of panels on diversity, let's have diverse panels moving forward. I would like to thank Kim Link Wills at Freightwaves, who wrote an article about my speech on the panel. And also all the people who shared the article that was written about what I said, my statement, that I have given the women in the maritime community a platform to speak up so we can listen to them. As you know, 47% of the guests in the shipping podcast are females. And I was given the name The Voice of Change in that article. I'm honored, and I will do my best to live up to that. I promise you. So until the next time, from me to you, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a shipping podcast available and that they should download it and listen to the maritime professionals who are sharing their passion for the shipping industry.